G'day guys, welcome back to True Eagle. Today I wanted to do a little video analysing all of the trades West Coast have done in recent times. I've gone through the last 5 years all the way through to 2020 and 2019. And what I'm going to do is go deal by deal and do an analysis of how did we actually do in these trade negotiations. I spent a lot of time online, reading the thoughts and opinions of Eagles fans. And now naturally, my first year of running a West Coast Eagles fan channel, I naturally have a lot of exposure to what Eagles fans say. And there seems to be a little bit of a belief, and I don't know how widespread that belief is, that West Coast have done a really bad job with their trading and drafting in recent years. And I thought what I'd do is I'd do two videos. I do a video assessing how our trading's been over the last 5 or so years, and I'll do a separate video analysing how well we've drafted, given the context of where we're selecting from, what was the strength of that draft, etc. There's also, I spent a little bit of time this year looking at how some of the best teams in the AFL have built their list, and in particular, I've mentioned this before, but I did a Hawthorn video in recent times, and we see that a huge chunk of their regular contributors at the moment were players that they didn't trade, first round draft picks for, but it's actually a lot of the lower level deals that they've done along the way that have built a bit of depth in their best 22. So for instance, if we're looking at the Hawthorn model specifically, Massimo D'Ambrosio, Jack Ginnivan, Lloyd Meeks, Sam Frost, Mabior Chol, Jack Scrimshaw, Carl Amon, and Jarman Impey. All those players are pretty regular players at Hawthorn, who are more or less best 22 in fact, none of whom cost a first rounder. So I suppose leading on from that, using relatively cheap deals to build depth in your squad and find role players is an important way to build your list. So in this video, I'm going to go through all the little deals we've done over the last 5 years to get a read on where we're at and how we've gone. Bearing in mind, a lot of these trade negotiations happened under a different regime. We now have a new list manager. We've turned it over a bit, but let's still have a look. So in this video, I'm going to go through, a high profile trade. We can start with Tim Kelly. Now, I did actually want to exclude Tim Kelly originally from this because in my head, the Tim Kelly deal really came in that previous era of West Coast when we were trying to preserve our premiership window. And I thought it would kind of make more sense to look past that to see what we've done since, because we already know how that more or less turned out. Then I thought, what if I do a video about this? I know that the first reaction is going to be, well, if you remove the horrendous Tim Kelly deal, then this analysis looks so much better. So we are going to touch on it. We will touch on it. But we're going to move on to 2 free agents that we've signed over the last 5 years, and a lot of lower level deals we've done for role players at other clubs. They generally have been Western Australian. We'll even look at how we've negotiated when players have left this football club, of which I think there's only been 2 that I can remember that have traded out of West Coast up until this year, where we have 2 with Barras and Jack Darling, of course. And we'll even look at how our pick swaps went and our live trades. So without further ado, let's get into it. Now, I feel like this Tim Kelly trade is a big landmark moment in West Coast history, and I think there's been enough discussion about it, to be honest. We don't need to deep dive it too much more to know that we made a move to try and preserve our premiership window, and everything kind of disintegrated after about 18 months of Tim Kelly being at West Coast. My personal view is I would have been pretty filthy if West Coast had not traded for Tim Kelly, given the context at the time. We needed an A-grade midfielder. He'd just come off an All-Australian year. Obviously, I think he's performed okay at West Coast, but, when the whole team around him disintegrates, it first of all makes him look a little bit worse. And second of all, we've been a bit hamstrung with a couple of years in the draft there. So we already know all this. However, I'm going to map out exactly what we gave up and what players we gave up the access to in those drafts. So let's have a look. In 2019, we gave up pick 14, we gave up pick 24, pick 33, and then in 2020, we gave up our first round draft pick, which ended up being pick 18, and we also gave up a 4th round selection. We gained Tim Kelly, we gained pick 64 in that draft, and we gained a 2020 3rd round selection. So who did we miss out on? Well, it's not pretty. I'm not going to lie to you. So originally, Geelong took Cooper Stevens with their first selection in that draft, which was our selection. Would we have taken Cooper Stevens? You can't superficially just say we would have ended up with the players Geelong ended up, of course. The other realistic ones, Georgiades was taken like 4 picks later. He was West Australian. I would argue we probably didn't have a need for him, but we could have selected him on talent anyway. There's a chance we would have gone Sam De Koning. He's pretty good. But Dev Robertson was another highly rated West Australian talent. He was a Lark medalist that year. We may have picked up Dev, and that probably wouldn't have been the best draft selection anyway. But let's move on to pick 24. So after all, live trades and stuff like that, this ended up being Jeremy Sharp to the Gold Coast Suns. And as it currently stands, Jeremy Sharp's actually had a pretty good year. So maybe we could have used a Jeremy Sharp. I don't think he was particularly great at Gold Coast. He obviously got delisted. But he's not the worst player, so pick 24 Jeremy Sharp, it's worth noting. It's also worth noting that Trent Rivers went not too long after that. That would have been very nice. However, we are speculating. We don't know if West Coast would have picked Trent Rivers. However, he was a West Australian talent. With pick 33, this gets messy. I've tried to simplify it as much as possible, but this became Nick Bryan from Essendon. There was pick swaps around the place because we did a side deal with Essendon first before this Geelong deal. But anyway, essentially, we gave up pick 33, and that would have given us access to Chad Warner. I hate to say it, Chad Warner went at pick 39 in the 2019 draft. And again, we could have overlooked him, but being a West Australian young midfielder, there is a chance. There is a chance we would have taken Chad Warner. That one is somewhat realistic. In 2020, our first rounder went to GWS. This is where Geelong traded for Jeremy Cameron. GWS took Ryan Angwin. It's really difficult to forecast who we would have taken, but it is worth noting Max Holmes went a couple of picks later. So again, in an ideal world, an alternate reality, we could have ended up with, say, Georgiades, Trent Rivers, Chad Warner, and Max Holmes. That sounds outstanding, but let's be real, we probably wouldn't have nailed all those draft picks. But there is enough to suggest there we possibly could have lost Chad Warner. And I will stand by the decision to trade for Tim Kelly because I don't want to be a revisionist and support it at the time and then criticize the club after. That's my personal opinion. However, I do think that our negotiating in this deal was not great. We could have easily just given 14, 18, and 24 and held on to pick 33. Now, that might sound like a small detail, but that could have been the difference between us having Chad Warner and not. So I think it is a very fair criticism to suggest that West Coast was a little bit generous in this particular deal, considering he's out of contract. 14, 18, and 24 is very generous without giving 33 as well. And in this case, you could clearly say it cost us someone like a Chad Warner. So we've got the Team Kelly deal out of the way. Let's move to some other deals we've made. So we've made 2 free agency acquisitions out West Coast, in the last 5 years. And one was in 2022 and one was in 2023. So we're talking about Jaden Hunt and Matthew Flynn. Now, free agency is nice because we didn't have to give up anything in these scenarios. So there's not too much you could say or criticize about these particular moves. But I will give us a lot of credit for picking up Jaden Hunt because at the time it seemed like a strange move given our list position. But I suppose West Coast identified a need for some upper middle-aged players, if that makes sense. Not someone right at the end, somebody with a bit to offer, and he had run and carry. And to be honest, Jaden Hunt, particularly in his first season, was absolutely wonderful. And this year, probably less so, but you'd say for giving up nothing, that's all sweet. Matthew Flynn, again, this was just a bit of a roll of the dice because we needed ruck depth. He was an unproven player. And his first year at West Coast didn't go well, but that's probably a little bit too early to truly assess that. But we didn't give anything up, so there isn't too much to worry about there. So let's talk about cheap player acquisitions. There are a number of Western Australia, and actually one non-West Australian player we recruited from other clubs to join us for cheap deals because again, this is set against the backdrop of the Tim Kelly deal. Not only was the pandemic a big factor, the 2020 draft turned out poor. That was one of the drafts we traded out of for Tim Kelly. What we were left with was not a whole lot of draft picks. So we were looking at alternate ways we can add to our list. And we probably even identified back then, there's a bit of a gap in the middle age part of our list. So we went after players like Zach Langdon, Alex Witherden, and Sam Petrevski-Seton. So let's assess those one by one. In 2020, we traded pick 54 for Zach Langdon. Now, again, this all gets messy. I will say this exercise was extremely difficult to go and find out what happened to the picks we gave up because in some instances, they were absorbed by academy picks. They were traded on. Some were unused. In this case, pick 54 apparently ended up at Fremantle as part of the Jesse Hogan deal. That is when Jesse Hogan went to GWS from Fremantle. And then that pick gets buried with academy bids. Now, as a player, Zach Langdon, it didn't go particularly well. He was delisted with a year left on his contract. We had to be aggressive with that move. And, without criticizing too harshly, it added really nothing to our list. So did we give up anything that would hurt us? Well, 2020, we held 2 late selections that year. And like I said, because of the pandemic, a lot of those draftees didn't get a full year of footy. As such, the draft wasn't that long. I think it was like 57 picks or something like that. One of the shortest drafts in modern times. And we took Izzy Winder and Luke Edwards with late selections. Now, Had we not given up this pick, we might have had a pick a few picks earlier. And it's worth noting that Eddie Ford from North Melbourne went one pick before Izzy Winder. Eddie Ford looks like a decent talent at North Melbourne, so technically we gave up access to someone like him, best case scenario. My personal opinion is we were probably always taking Izzy Winder, given, we were probably going risk averse with that particular draft, and he was a local talent. So in other words, this was a 0-0 draw. So let's talk about Alex Witherden. That was in 2020 as well. We added these guys at the same time. We gave up pick 58 and a future third round selection to get Alex Witherden and pick 86 from Brisbane. So pick 58 to 86. This is also pretty much null and void. 58 to 86 meant nothing because the whole draft lasted about 58 picks. So we're talking really nothing. So you just look at what we gave up in the 2021 draft, which was our third round selection. Geelong took Flynn Kruger, and I don't know really anything about Flynn Kruger. Other than that, some other realistic options we could have looked at, semi-realistic. There's Jai Sarong, who is a young defender at Hawthorn, who's cracked a few games and looks all right. He's the younger brother of Caleb. He's a tall defender. Possibly that will turn out where he could be better than Witherden, but it's unclear. And we could have also potentially taken Harvey Harrison, who is a small forward at Collingwood, who does look pretty good. But again, this is assuming that we took one of the two best players around that range, which is probably unrealistic. And to be honest, what we've gotten out of Witherden has been okay. He has been a best 22 player, and whilst I think our best team going forward probably doesn't have Witherden starting in our back six, he has been somewhat serviceable at a tough time for this football club and important depth, and it's actually still possible. Witherden hasn't been delisted, and I've said previously I think he could survive past this year given our depth, but it is possible he continues to add something to us. So I have to conclude that this is actually a pretty good trade outcome for us. It's also worth noting that there are two ways, I probably should have said at the start, but there's two ways to assess the quality of a trade, right? You consider in the moment, did we get the best value out of a deal based on the negotiating power we have? So for instance, could we have been a bit firmer with Geelong given Kelly was out of contract and desperate to come home? I think yes. Then there's another way to analyze it, and that's looking at how the picks turned out. So let's move to 2021 where we added another mature player from Carlton, Sam Petrevski-Seton. He was a former top 6 pick who was basically, a little bit out of favour from memory at Carlton. He had played 100 games, and we just thought, maybe we can get a best 22 player out of him, even if it's for a short period of time. We gave up pick 52, which Carlton fans were very salty about at the time. But all I'll say about this is the pick that we gave away was around about the same range as the Witherden one. So you apply the same logic. It could have been one of Jai Sarong and Harvey Harrison. So you could say, we don't give up either of those picks. We don't get Witherden or SPS, and we could have Jai Sarong and Harvey Harrison. Maybe that is a slightly better scenario, but again, it's slim margins at this point, and that would even be assuming that we picked the best players we could have. So let's talk about players leaving. There's a couple of these, right? So Tom Hickey was one of them, and we gave up Tom Hickey, pick 34 and pick 60, and we gained pick 58, 62, a 2021, which was a future second round selection from Port Adelaide, and a 2021 Sydney third round selection. So let's unpack how that all worked out. First of all, we'll note that Tom Hickey did have a good little stint there at Sydney, like a very good stint. It's also worth noting, at the time we didn't really need Hickey. He was out of favour. Nick Nat-Nui won back-to-back All-Australians in 2020 and 2021. So there was that. So I don't really blame us for letting that move happen, although maybe it would have been nice to have Tom Hickey in 2022 and 2023. But aside from that, how do we go in that actual deal? Well, pick 34 that went to Sydney in this deal got absorbed by an Errol Goulden bid. If we had held the pick, a couple of players we could have taken were Beau McCreary and Samson Ryan. It's possible. We gave up pick 60 in this scenario, but we ended up taking Luke Edwards at pick 62 with one of the picks we got back from Sydney. So that's a downgrade of 60 to 62. That probably would have been the same outcome. This deal did not help us get Luke Edwards, but pick 58 was then traded for Witherden. Port Adelaide's future second round selection that we got in this deal became Rhett Bazzo, and Sydney's third round pick that we got in this deal was then traded onto Carlton for Sam Petrevski-Seton. So again, we're mixing around timelines here a little bit, but essentially if we had to break down the algebra of this, we gave up Tom Hickey and access to one of Beau McCreary and Samson Ryan, but it got us Alex Witherden, Rhett Bazzo, and Sam Petrevski-Seton. And I suppose, to be honest, I think the outcome of this trade really depends on the trajectory of Rhett Bazzo, who I still think could be part of the next premiership team eventually. Like, I could see him being a best 22 player in a good team. That is his upside. But it's probably a little bit early to assess to what extent we won this trade. We know that Hickey had a great couple of seasons at Sydney. He probably couldn't have done that for us, given Nick Naitanui was All-Australian in 2021. So to be honest, that one is kind of a slight win based on the outcome of having Rhett Bazzo, who I am glad we have. Another player who left us was Willie Rioli at the end of 2022. Now, this one included a massive mega deal and falls under a few categories because not only did we pick split, but we traded away a player. So let's just cover off this mega deal where Jason Horne-Francis joined Port Adelaide. We gave up Willie Rioli and we also split pick 2 down to 8 and 12. So what did we give up in this deal? Well, we gave up pick 2, we gave up pick 40, and we gave up Willie Rioli. What did we gain? We gained pick 8 and 12, and that became Ruben Jinby and Elijah Hewitt. We got Port Adelaide's 2023 second rounder, which was a future second. That became part of Clay Hall, and that we'll talk about the Clay Hall thing in a second. And we also got Port Adelaide's 2023 third rounder, and that became half of Tyler Brockman because pick 44 was the pick, but we traded 2 picks to Hawthorn, so it's a little messy. So I think you can probably split this mega trade, which involved something like 6 clubs, and break it down into, say, pick 2 became 8 and 12. So really we're talking Sheasel versus Hewitt and Jinby. Now, like I said, I want to separate this video from trading and drafting. However, these things are probably interlinked, aren't they? Trading for a draft pick, the talent assessment of Ruben Jinby and Elijah Hewitt versus Harry Sheasel. Now, I've said this previously, but it was pretty well known that Sheasel didn't want to leave Victoria. This was also said about George Wardlaw. It was not said about Aaron Cadman, so there was a chance if West Coast held pick 2, they might have drafted Aaron Cadman. Instead, they decided to split the pick and take 2 local selections, and I honestly think this is awesome. It was a great outcome. So parking that, we got the players we wanted, in my opinion. So we gave up Willie Rioli and pick 40, apparently. I can't find out what the hell happened to pick 40 in this deal. There were 6 clubs. I don't know where it ended up. Wikipedia usually has a good history of like where the pick came from. It just seemed to disappear. So forgive me, but I don't think it's going to be super relevant. What we essentially gained for Willie Rioli and pick 40 was Port Adelaide's second rounder in 2023 and their third rounder, which was pick 44. So you can simplify this further. We gave up Willie Rioli for Port Adelaide's second rounder in 2023, and we copped a 4-pick downgrade of 40 to 44. We on-traded that 44 for Brockman, so to simplify it further, Willie Rioli and pick 40 got traded for half of Brockman and half of Clay Hall. So again, that one's really messy, but I think we can, on balance, conclude that we got shafted in that. And at the end of the day, I don't really blame list manager or whoever really was overseeing that particular deal, because the context was Willie Rioli had been injured and been problematic behaviorally and come off a 2-year ban and bad attitude, out of contract. There were just so many reasons why his value dropped. And there was always going to be the likelihood that he became a good player at Port Adelaide, which he has, and he's absolutely exceeded what Port Adelaide got out of that. So that was a bargain for Port Adelaide, but I don't really blame us in that scenario because we weren't in a strong trading position. So unlike the Kelly deal, we were weak there. This one, we were kind of always going to get screwed over. Let's talk about some live trades. We've done 2 with Port Adelaide and we've done 1 with Richmond last year. So in 2021, we live traded with Port Adelaide down the draft order. We had pick 10 and that became Josh Sin. We traded the pick 10 to go 2 spots back to pick 12 to take Campbell Chesser, and that also gave us Port Adelaide's second rounder in 2022. So it was essentially pick 10 for pick 12 and 29. Now, on face value, that is good trading. We've done well there, considering it was said we were probably taking Campbell Chesser even at pick 10. So it really gave us a free swing in the second round. So this was a great result if you're assessing the quality of our trading. The secondary element is to consider that Campbell Chesser and Kobe Bergiel haven't really worked out that well. Campbell Chesser absolutely still could turn it around, but for a first round draft pick, he hasn't made a big impact at AFL level, and Bergiel is sitting without a contract right now. We're nearly in October. But that's probably a draft assessment, right? So the live trade probably didn't yield really good benefits. Josh Sin went to Port Adelaide, and to be honest, I don't think he's really making a huge impact either. Josh Sin and Ben Hobbs were the 2 players we lost access to by doing this deal. Ben Hobbs was another one that was said not to want to leave Victoria, according to the rumours. So this one, it was a good deal in the moment, but it probably didn't really yield too much value. In the same draft, we live traded with Port Adelaide again. If you remember, we traded a future 4th round selection to get a pick 62 at the last minute to draft Greg Clark. Greg Clark, probably a victim of circumstance, coming into a team as a top-up, ready-made, mature midfielder, and the team, the list disintegrated. He was also probably played a little bit out of position. Either way, didn't have a big impact, but the 4th rounder we gave up went to the Power. They drafted Tom Scully, the key forward, at the end of that draft as well, which was technically our selection. So probably wouldn't have taken him anyway. Again, probably a 0-0 draw. And finally, 2023 saw one live trade, which is too early to assess, but we did give up pick 40 and a future 3rd rounder in the 2024 draft, the draft that is yet to come, for pick 38 and essentially Clay Hall. So we traded pick 40, which was Kane McAuliffe, and we traded our 3rd rounder out this year. So this one we need some time to assess. We need to assess how good Clay Hall is. Fairly promising start to his career to play a handful of games in your first year for a pick 38. That's fine. But we'll see how this draft goes. This was a particularly ballsy move. Normally we're trading down. This is the only instance we've traded up. So the proof will be in the pudding, and hopefully Clay Hall has a good career at West Coast. Anyway, guys, I hope you got something out of that. That was assessing all of our trades. I suppose I'd conclude that there were some good deals along the way. The biggest howler was probably, in my opinion, if we're assessing the negotiating, giving up an extra 2nd rounder for Tim Kelly. Other than that, we've had a few free swings, at players, and to some extent we've gotten value. In some cases, we've virtually got no value. We got screwed over in the Junior Rioli trade. I think we had a bit of a win trading down to 8 and 12 and getting Jinby and Hewitt. I think over time that will look good. As good as Harry Sheasel is, I don't think he would have stayed at West Coast. So let me know in the comments what you think, what you assess. Did this video change your mind at all? Regardless, looking forward to hearing from you, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.